It was a bright, sunny afternoon in a small, bustling neighborhood where laughter filled the streets. Children played basketball on a nearby court, dogs barked happily, and neighbors greeted each other as they went about their day. Among the lively scenes, a 12-year-old boy stood at the corner of a quiet street, his folding table neatly arranged with colorful boxes of cookies. His face beamed with excitement as he called out to passers-by, holding up a sign that read, "Support my school fundraiser." The boy had been out there for hours, trying to raise money for his school trip. Every time someone stopped to buy a box, his smile grew wider. Some people praised him for working so hard, while others even gave him a little extra, telling him to keep the change. It was the kind of small-town moment that warmed the heart of an honest kid working to achieve his goal. But not everyone saw it that way. A police car rolled slowly down the street, its siren quiet, but the sight of it always carried a certain weight. For some in the neighborhood, it was a reassuring symbol of safety. For others, it meant trouble. The officer inside the car glanced at the boy on the corner, then pulled over with a screech of brakes. The boy, unaware of the watchful eyes now focused on him, happily handed a box of cookies to an elderly woman who had stopped by to support him. He thanked her and tucked the cash into a small tin beside him. But as soon as the police officer stepped out of the car, everything about the moment seemed to shift. The officer, tall and stern-faced, walked toward the boy with purpose. His boots clapped against the pavement, the sound echoing louder than it should have on that peaceful street. People nearby slowed their steps, some glancing over curiously, others avoiding the scene altogether. "Hey, kid," the officer barked, his tone sharp and authoritative. The boy froze, his cheerful demeanor fading into confusion. "Yes, sir?" he asked politely, looking up at the man in uniform. "Do you have a permit to be selling these?" the officer asked, gesturing toward the table of cookies. The boy hesitated. "A permit? No, sir. I'm just raising money for my school trip," he explained nervously, clutching the sign he had made the night before with colorful markers. The officer's frown deepened, and he crossed his arms. "It's against city regulations to sell goods on public property without a permit. You can't just set up shop wherever you feel like it," he said, his voice growing more stern. "But I didn't know." The boy started, his voice trembling slightly. He glanced at the small crowd that was beginning to form, their faces a mix of concern and unease. Ignorance wasn't an excuse, according to the officer. Without another word, he reached for his radio and called for backup. "I've got a situation here," he said, speaking into the device clipped to his shoulder. The boy's heart began to race. He had never been in trouble before, and the sight of the officer's hand resting on the radio made his stomach churn. He looked at the cookies on his table, the tin of money, and the sign he had worked so hard on. Was he really doing something wrong? By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of more neighbors. An older woman stepped forward, her hands on her hips. "Officer, he's just a kid. He's selling cookies for school, for goodness sake," she said firmly, her voice laced with frustration. The officer turned to her, his face unyielding. "Rules are rules, ma'am. If we let one person slide, then everyone thinks they can do the same. That's how chaos starts," he said flatly. The boy, now visibly shaking, tried to explain again. "I didn't mean to break any rules. I just wanted to help my school. I didn't know I needed a permit." But the officer wasn't listening. He grabbed the tin of money and began packing up the cookies into a box, muttering something about evidence. The boy's eyes filled with tears as he watched everything he had worked for being taken away. "Turn around," the officer said abruptly. The boy blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. What? "Turn around," the officer repeated, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The small crowd gasped. Some people took out their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. The boy's hands trembled as he slowly turned, his small wrists being locked into the cold steel cuffs. "You're under arrest for selling goods without a permit," the officer said, his voice loud and matter-of-fact. The boy's world seemed to stop. He couldn't believe what was happening. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a kid trying to do something good. Tears streamed down his face as the officer led him toward the police car, his table of cookies left abandoned on the corner. The crowd erupted in protests. "He's just a child," someone shouted. "This is ridiculous," said another. A man in a suit stepped forward, his phone still recording. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice firm. "This is harassment." But the officer ignored them all, his grip on the boy's arm unwavering. The boy looked back at the crowd, his eyes pleading for help, but he didn't know what anyone could do. As the officer opened the door to the police car and guided the boy inside, something unexpected happened. From the crowd, a young woman stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "Officer, stop," she said firmly. The officer turned to her, annoyed. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back unless you want to be cited for interfering with an arrest." But the woman didn't flinch. She held up her phone, revealing that she had been live streaming the entire incident. "You've been recorded from the moment you stepped out of your car," she said, her tone unwavering. "And I think the world deserves to see how you're treating a child for selling cookies." The officer hesitated, glancing at the phone in her hand. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. By now, the live stream had gained traction, and people from all over the country were tuning in. Comments flooded in, expressing outrage and disbelief at what they were witnessing. Calls were being made to local authorities, demanding an explanation. The woman took a step closer, her voice rising so everyone could hear. "This boy didn't hurt anyone. He didn't commit a crime. He's just trying to make an honest effort to support his education. And you're going to arrest him for that?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the growing attention pressing down on him. The crowd grew louder, their voices a united force of anger and frustration. The boy, still sitting in the back of the police car, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but for the first time since the officer arrived, he felt a glimmer of hope. The woman turned her attention back to the officer. "Let him go," she demanded. "This isn't justice. It's abuse of power." The officer clenched his jaw, clearly torn. The crowd was growing restless, the live stream was going viral, and the boy's tear-streaked face was burned into everyone's minds. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the officer reached for his radio. What he said next would change everything. The officer's hand hovered over his radio, his face betraying the frustration boiling inside him. He glanced at the crowd, then at the woman with the phone still aimed at him. For a brief moment, it seemed as if he might double down on his actions, but then he pressed a button and muttered into it, his voice low. Situation de-escalated. Suspect being released. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, but the tension was far from gone. The officer unlocked the door of the police car and gestured for the boy to step out. His small frame moved slowly, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he was really free or if it was some sort of cruel trick. The woman with the phone walked over and crouched down beside him, speaking softly. "Are you okay?" she asked. The boy nodded, though his face told a different story. His eyes darted to the officer, then to the broken-down table still sitting on the corner. His fundraiser was ruined, his hard work scattered in the chaos. The tin with his money was still in the officer's possession. "I'm sorry about the trouble, ma'am," the officer said gruffly, though his tone carried no genuine apology. He handed the tin back to the boy without meeting his eyes. "Next time, make sure you have the proper permits." The boy clutched the tin against his chest, his hands trembling. The officer returned to his car, avoiding the stares of the angry crowd. A few people booed as the vehicle pulled away, its engine revving loudly down the street. The boy turned to the woman who had defended him, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you for helping me," he said. She smiled gently, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. You don't have to thank me. What happened to you was wrong, and everyone here knows it. She looked around at the neighbors who had stayed to show their support. You're not alone, okay? We're all here for you. The crowd murmured in agreement, but the boy couldn't shake the fear that had settled in his chest. He had only wanted to raise money for something good. How could something so innocent turn into such a nightmare? The woman stood up and addressed the crowd. This isn't just about today. It's about how we're treated, about the way people in power use their authority against those who don't deserve it. Her voice carried a quiet anger, the kind that came from years of witnessing injustice. We have to speak up when we see things like this happen. That's the only way we'll ever see change. The boy watched as the crowd slowly began to disperse, some offering kind words or a gentle pat on his back before leaving. A few stayed behind to help him gather his things. His cookies had been crushed in the chaos, the sign he had made was torn, and the table was wobbly from being shoved aside. He stared at the mess, feeling the sting of tears again. One of the neighbors, a kind older man, knelt down beside him. You're a brave young man, he said softly. Don't let what happened today stop you from doing good. People will always try to tear you down when you're doing something right. The boy nodded but didn't say anything. Deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it. As the woman helped him pack up, she asked gently, Do your parents know you were out here today? He hesitated before answering. My mom does. She said it was okay as long as I stayed in the neighborhood. She works late, so she doesn't always have time to help me with stuff like this. The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. Do you want me to walk you home? The boy shook his head quickly. No, thank you. I'll be okay. He didn't want to seem weak or helpless, even though his heart was still racing from the confrontation. Before she could say more, a car pulled up to the curb. A man in a suit stepped out, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He looked at the woman, then at the boy. I saw the live stream, he said, his voice steady. I came as soon as I could. The boy frowned, unsure of who the man was or why he seemed so interested. The woman stepped between them protectively. Who are you? She asked, her tone cautious. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. I'm an attorney, he explained. I specialize in cases like this. When I saw what happened, I knew I had to come. This young man was treated unfairly, and I'd like to help. The boy stared at the card but didn't take it. He didn't fully understand what the man was offering or why he cared. The woman glanced at the card, then back at the man. What exactly are you offering? A chance to make sure this doesn't happen again, the attorney said firmly. Incidents like this happen far too often, and they usually go unnoticed. But this time, it was caught on video, and people are paying attention. If we act now, we can hold the officer accountable and push for real change. The boy felt a mix of emotions: confusion, fear, and a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what real change meant, but he didn't want anyone else to feel the way he had today. The woman looked at the boy, her expression softening. It's your choice, she said gently. No one can make you do anything you don't want to do. But if you want to stand up for yourself, we'll be right here with you. The boy thought about it for a long moment. He didn't like the idea of being in the spotlight, of having people talk about him and what had happened. But he also didn't want to feel powerless anymore. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. I'll do it. The attorney smiled, a hint of admiration in his eyes. You're a brave young man, he said, echoing the words of the neighbor earlier. We'll take this one step at a time. The woman gave the boy a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You're not alone in this, she reminded him. As they finished packing up his things, the boy felt a strange sense of determination growing inside him. He didn't fully understand what lay ahead, but for the first time since the officer had arrived, he felt like he had a voice. That night, as the boy sat at the kitchen table with his mom, He told her everything that had happened. Her face shifted from disbelief to anger to sadness as he spoke, but she didn't interrupt. When he finished, she pulled him into a tight hug, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve any of it." He nodded against her shoulder, his eyes stinging again. "I just wanted to help," he said softly. "You did help," she told him firmly. "You showed everyone how strong you are. And now, we're going to make sure no one forgets it." The boy didn't know what the future held, but as he sat there with his mom, he felt a little stronger, a little braver. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer consumed him. The next day, the video from the live stream continued to spread, drawing attention from people far beyond their small neighborhood. News outlets picked up the story, headlines calling attention to the boy's arrest and the community's outrage. Some people praised the boy's courage, while others debated the officer's actions. The attorney's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, activists, and even other families who had faced similar situations. The boy watched it all from the sidelines, unsure of how to feel about the sudden attention. He didn't want to be famous or special, he just wanted to go back to being a normal kid. But as more and more people reached out to support him, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for the boy and his mother. Reporters began showing up in their neighborhood, knocking on their door and asking for interviews. His mother tried her best to shield him from the growing media storm, but it was impossible to ignore. The video had gone viral, with thousands of people commenting, sharing, and debating what had happened. Some called for the officer to be fired, while others claimed the boy had been in the wrong for selling cookies without a permit. The boy couldn't understand why something so simple had become so complicated. At school, the whispers followed him down the hallways. Some kids looked at him differently, like he was someone important now. Others avoided him entirely, worried that talking to him might somehow drag them into the mess. His closest friends tried to cheer him up, but even their usual jokes couldn't lift the heavy weight sitting on his chest. His mom sat him down one evening after dinner, her face lined with exhaustion. "I know this is a lot to deal with," she said gently, reaching across the table to take his hand. "But you're not in this alone. You have so many people standing behind you. I just need you to remember that, no matter what happens, you're stronger than this." He nodded, though he didn't feel strong. He felt small, like the world was spinning out of control, and he was caught in the middle of it. The attorney came by almost every day, preparing them for what lay ahead. He explained the legal process in simple terms, but it still felt overwhelming. The boy didn't fully understand what it meant to hold someone accountable or why so many people cared about his story. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, the attorney placed a folder on the table. "I need you to know that this won't be easy," he said, looking directly at the boy. "The officer's department is already trying to defend his actions. They're saying he was just doing his job, that he didn't mean any harm." The boy frowned. "But he did mean harm," he said quietly. "He didn't have to treat me like that." "You're right," the attorney agreed. "But proving that in court is going to take time. And it's going to take courage from you. Are you ready for that?" The boy hesitated, glancing at his mom. She gave him an encouraging nod, and he took a deep breath. "I'll do it," he said. As the date of the hearing approached, the tension in the neighborhood grew. The woman who had recorded the video rallied the community, organizing peaceful gatherings to show their support. Signs appeared in windows and on lawns, messages of unity and justice written in bold letters. The boy's story had become a symbol for something much larger than himself, and while he didn't fully understand it, he felt the weight of it pressing down on him. The officer, meanwhile, remained silent. His department released a statement defending his actions, claiming he had followed protocol and that the incident had been blown out of proportion. But the more they tried to justify what had happened, the more people seemed to rally against them. One evening, As the boy and his mom walked home from the store, they noticed a car parked across the street. A man sat inside, his eyes fixed on their house. His presence sent a shiver down the boy's spine. His mom grabbed his hand and quickened her pace, her eyes darting nervously. When they reached their door, she locked it behind them and peered through the curtains. The car was still there, the man unmoving. "Stay away from the windows," she whispered, her voice trembling. The boy's heart pounded as he sat on the couch, clutching a pillow tightly. "Who is he?" he asked. "I don't know," his mom replied, her voice low. "But we're not taking any chances." The car eventually drove off, but the unease lingered. The boy didn't sleep that night, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. His mom called the attorney the following morning, her voice shaking as she described what had happened. The attorney promised to look into it, but his tone betrayed his concern. As the hearing drew closer, the boy's anxiety grew. He couldn't escape the feeling that something bad was going to happen. The attorney warned them that the officer's lawyers would try to discredit him, to make him seem like a troublemaker or a liar. The idea of sitting in a courtroom, facing the man who had humiliated him, made his stomach churn. The night before the hearing, his mom sat beside him on his bed, brushing a hand through his hair like she used to when he was younger. "No matter what happens tomorrow," she said softly, "I'm proud of you. You've already done so much just by speaking up." He nodded, but her words did little to calm the storm inside him. The next morning, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters and protesters. The boy gripped his mom's hand tightly as they made their way through the crowd, the attorney leading the way. Cameras flashed, and voices shouted questions, but he kept his eyes down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The officer sat at a table with his lawyers, his expression unreadable. The boy couldn't look at him for more than a few seconds without feeling the anger and fear bubbling up again. The proceedings began, and the attorney presented their case with calm confidence. He showed the video, letting the courtroom see the officer's actions for themselves. The boy watched as the scene played out on the screen, feeling the humiliation all over again. When it was time for him to speak, his hands shook as he approached the stand. He glanced at his mom, who gave him a reassuring smile. Taking a deep breath, he told his story, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. He described how he had just been trying to sell cookies, how the officer had treated him like a criminal for no reason. The officer's lawyers tried to twist his words, asking questions designed to make him doubt himself. But the boy held firm, repeating the truth as clearly as he could. The attorney had prepared him for this, and he refused to let them shake him. As the hearing continued, the tension in the room grew thicker. The officer's defense relied on technicalities, arguing that he had been within his rights to question the boy. But the video painted a different picture, one that was hard to ignore. The boy's heart raced as the day wore on, each moment feeling heavier than the last. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, judging him, waiting to see how this would all end. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for certain: he had done everything he could to stand up for himself. The attorney leaned over and whispered something to him as the proceedings paused for a brief recess. "You've done great," he said with a small smile. "Just a little longer now." The boy nodded, his hands still trembling. The climax was near, and everyone in the room could feel it. The truth was out there, undeniable and raw. All that remained was to see how the system would respond. The courtroom sat in tense silence as everyone waited for the hearing to resume. The boy gripped the edge of his chair, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. His mom placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but her own anxiety was plain in her tight grip. The attorney sifted through his notes one last time, his brow furrowed in concentration. Across the room, the officer sat still, his face impassive, but something in his rigid posture betrayed his unease. When the judge returned, the murmurs died down, and all attention shifted to the proceedings. The defense continued their arguments, emphasizing procedural guidelines and attempting to paint the incident as a misunderstanding. They spoke about permits, regulations, and the supposed confusion over the boy's intentions. But the arguments fell thin. The prosecutor, leaning on the weight of the viral video, countered each point calmly and decisively, refocusing the courtroom on the reality of the officer's actions. Then something unexpected happened. The officer's lawyers called a surprise witness, a colleague from the department. The officer's partner, a veteran officer with years of experience, was sworn in. As he took the stand, the tension in the room thickened. His presence was unexpected, and even the boy's attorney seemed caught off guard. The officer's partner initially spoke carefully, stating that they had been taught to follow specific protocols when dealing with minors in public. He described how they were instructed to ensure safety and de-escalate situations. But then, as the defense tried to steer him towards supporting the officer's actions, his tone shifted. The partner hesitated, glanced at the officer, then at the boy. "I can't stand by everything that happened that day," he said finally, his voice low but firm. The room went still, as though everyone had collectively stopped breathing. "What I saw didn't feel right. It didn't align with how we're trained to handle situations like this." The officer's face tightened, a flash of anger crossing his features. His lawyers exchanged hurried whispers, clearly unprepared for this development. The partner continued, now addressing the judge directly. "I wasn't there for the entire encounter, but the way he approached that boy, the tone he used, it wasn't about enforcing any rules. It was personal. He saw a child and treated him like a criminal." The boy's mom gasped softly, and the attorney leaned forward, scribbling notes as fast as he could. The officer's partner had just shattered their defense, adding a layer of complexity to the case that no one had anticipated. The officer's lawyer immediately attempted to undermine the partner's testimony, pressing him about departmental policies and the supposed dangers of unregulated activities in public spaces. But the damage had been done. The partner's words lingered in the air, an admission that struck at the heart of the defense's narrative. As the day progressed, the boy's anxiety only grew. He had thought that the hardest part was over, that telling his story would be enough. But now, the case felt bigger than ever, spinning out of control. The weight of it all was suffocating. His mom noticed the tears welling up in his eyes and leaned down to whisper, "You've done everything you can. Just keep being brave, okay?" But things weren't over yet. As the courtroom adjourned for a recess, the boy and his mom stepped outside to get some air. The crowd outside had grown larger, with supporters holding signs and chanting for justice. But mixed in were a handful of people shouting angrily, claiming the boy's story was exaggerated or fabricated. The boy clung to his mom's hand, trying to block out the noise, but one voice cut through. "You're ruining a good man's life for attention," someone shouted, stepping closer. A man in a dark jacket pushed through the crowd, his face twisted with anger. Security moved quickly to intercept him, but not before the boy saw the pure hatred in the man's eyes. It shook him to his core, a stark reminder that not everyone was on his side. Back inside, the tension followed them. The boy sat silently beside his mom, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The second half of the hearing began, and the officer's defense scrambled to regain control. They introduced a series of documents and records, attempting to argue that the officer's behavior was consistent with his previous actions. But then, the prosecutor revealed something that caught everyone off guard. They had obtained body camera footage from the officer's previous interactions with community members. The judge allowed the footage to be played, and what it revealed sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. The video showed the officer interacting with other children in the neighborhood, kids who looked just like the boy. In one clip, he questioned a group of teens walking home from school, his tone aggressive and his language condescending. In another, he approached two young boys playing basketball on the sidewalk, demanding to see IDs and accusing them of loitering. The courtroom was silent as the footage played, the officer's pattern of behavior laid bare for all to see. The boy's stomach churned as he watched, realizing he wasn't the only one who had been treated this way. His mom shook her head, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. When the footage ended, the prosecutor turned to the officer, their voice sharp. This isn't about enforcing rules or ensuring safety. This is about targeting certain individuals based on how they look. Do you deny that? The officer didn't respond immediately. His jaw clenched as he stared at the table in front of him. His lawyers tried to intervene, objecting to the line of questioning, but the damage had been done. The boy's attorney took the opportunity to reinforce their case, painting a clear picture of the officer's bias and the harm it had caused. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, the stakes higher than ever. But just as it seemed the tide was turning, the officer's lawyer pulled out one last card. They introduced a new piece of evidence, something that no one had expected. It was a report from a witness who claimed to have seen the boy selling cookies that day. The report alleged that the boy had been approached by another adult earlier, someone who had been arguing with him about his sales. The room buzzed with whispers as the officer's lawyer read from the report, suggesting that the officer had been responding to a complaint rather than acting out of bias. The boy's heart sank as doubt crept into the room. Even though he knew the truth, the idea that someone else's actions could be used to justify what had happened made him feel powerless. The attorney quickly countered, questioning the credibility of the report and pointing out inconsistencies in the witnesses' statements. But the seed of uncertainty had been planted, and the boy could see it in the faces around the courtroom. As the day came to an end, the boy felt more confused and overwhelmed than ever. The officer's partner had stood up for him, the bodycam footage had exposed a troubling pattern, and yet, the defense's new evidence threatened to undermine everything. His mom hugged him tightly as they left the courthouse, shielding him from the cameras and questions waiting outside. "We're not giving up," she whispered firmly. "No matter what they throw at us, we're going to keep fighting." The boy nodded, though his chest felt heavy with doubt. He couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over, and that the hardest part was yet to come. The truth was out there, but getting people to see it and believe it was proving to be more complicated than he ever imagined. The courtroom was packed, the air so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. This was the final day, the one where everything would come to a head. The boy sat nervously beside his mom, clutching her hand as the judge entered the room. Cameras outside had captured every detail of their arrival, and though the boy couldn't hear the chants of the crowd anymore, he still felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. Everyone wanted justice, but would they get it? The prosecutor began with a powerful closing argument. They didn't just focus on the boy's story, they painted a vivid picture of the larger issue at hand. The boy was not an isolated case, they argued, but part of a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. The footage of the officer's past actions played a crucial role, as did the testimony of his partner, who had openly admitted to feeling uncomfortable about what happened. Every word from the prosecutor seemed to land with purpose, their voice rising and falling like waves crashing against the defense's carefully built walls. The defense, however, wasn't backing down. They doubled down on the witness statement they had presented the day before, trying to shift the narrative. They argued that the officer had been called to the scene because of a report of suspicious activity and that his actions, while perhaps poorly executed, were not rooted in prejudice but rather in concern for public safety. The lawyer's voice was calm, almost calculated, as they tried to sow seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. The boy's heart raced as the judge finally called for the officer to take the stand. It was a move the defense had avoided until now, but they had no choice if they wanted to salvage their case. The officer rose from his seat, adjusting his tie as he walked to the witness stand. His expression was neutral, but the boy could sense the tension beneath the surface. The defense began their questioning, giving the officer a chance to explain his actions. He spoke in a measured tone, claiming that he had no intention of harming or intimidating the boy. He said he was following protocol, that he had received a report about someone selling goods without a permit, and that he had acted based on the information he had at the time. But when the prosecutor began their cross-examination, the atmosphere shifted. Their questions were sharp and unrelenting, designed to peel back the layers of the officer's carefully constructed narrative. They asked why he had approached the boy in such an aggressive manner, why he hadn't taken a moment to assess the situation before escalating it. The officer's responses grew more defensive, his calm demeanor beginning to crack. And then the prosecutor brought out their final piece of evidence, a second body cam recording. This footage hadn't been played before, and the defense visibly tensed as it was presented. The prosecutor explained that this was the full, unedited version of the encounter, retrieved from the officer's own device. As the video played, the courtroom watched in stunned silence. It showed the officer approaching the boy, not with the cautious professionalism he had described, but with a harsh, accusatory tone. The boy's polite attempts to explain himself were ignored, and instead, the officer could be heard muttering something under his breath, a comment that revealed his bias in an unmistakable way. The officer's lawyer immediately objected, but the damage had been done. The video confirmed everything the boy had said, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs. The boy's mom squeezed his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, it felt like the truth was undeniable, like the weight of everything they had endured was finally being recognized. But just as relief began to wash over them, the unexpected twist came. One of the jurors raised their hand, requesting to speak. The judge hesitated but allowed it, a rare move that added another layer of tension to the room. The juror, an older woman, stood and addressed the courtroom. "I've sat here listening to all of this," she began, her voice steady but emotional, "and I can't help but think about my own grandson. He's 12 years old, just like this boy. And I'm ashamed to say that before this trial, I might have believed the officer's version of events without question. But seeing the footage, hearing the testimony, I can't ignore the truth anymore." Her words left the room silent. She turned to the officer, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't see a child that day. You saw a threat. And that's what needs to change." The judge quickly thanked the juror and instructed the jury to return to deliberations. The boy felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, fear, hope. The next moments would determine everything. The jury's deliberation felt like it lasted forever. The boy stared at the clock on the wall, counting each second as it ticked by. His mom sat quietly beside him, holding his hand but saying nothing. The courtroom buzzed with low conversations, but all he could hear was his own heartbeat. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent again. The foreperson stood, holding a piece of paper that seemed to carry the weight of the world. The boy's hands trembled as he waited for the verdict to be read. "On the charge of misconduct in the performance of duties, we find the defendant guilty." The room erupted in noise, cheers, gasps, and whispers all at once. The boy's mom pulled him into a tight embrace, her tears soaking into his shoulder. The officer's face was pale, his expression unreadable as the reality of the verdict sank in. But before the judge could dismiss the court, the prosecutor stood again. "Your Honor, we'd like to address one final matter." Everyone turned to look, confusion rippling through the crowd. The prosecutor continued, their voice firm. "During the course of this trial, it became clear that this case isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about a system that allowed this to happen in the first place. We're formally requesting an investigation into the policies and practices of the department to ensure this never happens again." The judge nodded solemnly, approving the request. The boy didn't fully understand the legal implications, but he knew one thing: this wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than that. As they left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into applause, chanting the boy's name. He felt overwhelmed but also proud. His story had made a difference, and even though it had been hard, he knew it was worth it. But as he climbed into the car with his mom, he noticed something across the street. A man in a dark jacket stood watching them, his expression unreadable. It was the same man who had shouted at him during the recess days earlier. The boy shivered, a sense of unease creeping over him. For now, justice had been served. But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a much larger battle. And though the road ahead seemed uncertain, he resolved to keep going, no matter what challenges came his way. As they drove away from the courthouse, the boy stared out the window, watching the crowd fade into the distance. His mom held the steering wheel tightly, her expression calm but reflective. The noise, the cameras, the chance it was finally over. Or at least, it felt like it should have been. But the boy couldn't shake the image of the man who had been watching them from across the street. It lingered in his mind like a shadow, nagging at the back of his thoughts. His mom must have sensed his unease because she reached over and gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "You did something brave," she said softly. "No matter what happens next, don't ever forget that." He nodded, but the weight of everything still felt heavy on his small shoulders. For weeks, his life had been turned upside down, and even though the courtroom verdict had brought some sense of justice, it didn't feel like the end. There were questions that still lingered about the system, about the officer, about what all of this really meant for the future. When they got home, the boy found himself sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring at the cookie recipe that had started it all. His mom had taped it to the fridge weeks ago, a reminder of his hard work and determination. It was strange how something so small, so simple, had led to something so big. He reached out and ran his fingers over the edges of the paper, thinking about how far they'd come since that day in the park. The sound of his mom's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. She was on the phone, speaking to someone with a mix of excitement and urgency. "Yes," she said, her voice rising slightly, "he's here." "No, I think that's a wonderful idea. Let me ask him." She turned to him with a smile. "That was one of the organizers from the community center," she explained. "They're hosting an event tomorrow to talk about what happened and what changes need to be made. They want you to speak." The boy blinked in surprise. "Me?" he asked, his voice small. His mom nodded. "They want to hear your story. It's important, you know. People are listening now. They want to understand." He hesitated, unsure if he was ready for something like that. But then he thought about the crowd outside the courthouse, the people chanting his name, and the juror who had spoken up in his defense. He realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he had. The next day, the boy stood nervously at the front of a small auditorium. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, community leaders, but also people he didn't recognize. Reporters sat quietly in the back, their cameras pointed toward him. His mom stood off to the side, giving him a reassuring nod. He took a deep breath and began to speak. At first, his words came out shaky, but as he continued, his voice grew stronger. He told them about the park, about how excited he had been to sell his cookies and how quickly things had spiraled out of control. He talked about the fear he'd felt, the confusion, and the way he had been treated like a criminal instead of a kid. But he also talked about the support he had received, the strangers who had shown up outside the courthouse, the lawyers who had fought for him, and the juror who had reminded everyone what justice really meant. He told them that while he was grateful for the verdict, it wasn't enough. Things needed to change, not just for him but for everyone. The room erupted into applause when he finished, and for the first time in weeks, the boy felt a sense of peace. He had found his voice, and people were listening. Over the next few weeks, the story continued to gain attention. News outlets ran articles about the boy, calling him a symbol of resilience and hope. The footage from the trial sparked debates about police reform, leading to discussions at the local and even national level. The department announced that it would review its policies, and the officer involved resigned before any further action could be taken against him. The boy and his mom tried to settle back into their normal routine, but things were different now. Everywhere they went, people recognized him, stopping to offer words of encouragement. or share their own stories. At first, it felt overwhelming, but over time, the boy began to see the impact his experience had made. One afternoon, as he was walking home from school, a man approached him. The boy froze for a moment, his heart racing as he recognized the face of the man who had been watching him outside the courthouse. But instead of anger or intimidation, the man's expression was one of regret. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," the man said quietly. "For how I treated you that day. For how I judged you without even knowing you. I was wrong." The boy didn't know what to say at first. He felt a mix of emotions: relief, confusion, maybe even a little forgiveness. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. The man walked away, leaving the boy standing there with a strange sense of closure. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase everything that had happened, but it was a start. As the weeks turned into months, life slowly returned to normal. The boy started baking cookies again, this time with his mom's help. But instead of selling them in the park, they began donating them to local shelters and community events. It was their way of giving back, of turning something painful into something positive. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, his mom looked at him and smiled. "You know," she said, "I think you've taught people something really important. Not just about fairness, but about standing up for what's right." The boy thought about everything they had been through: the fear, the fight, the moments of doubt and triumph. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. As he sat there, he realized that while the world wasn't perfect, it was changing. And maybe, just maybe, he had been a part of that change. He smiled back at his mom, feeling a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. "I think we all learned something," he said softly. And with that, their story came to a close, not as an ending, but as the beginning of something new. The boy knew there was still work to be done, but for now, he was content to take it one step at a time. After all, even the biggest changes start small, just like the simple act of baking cookies.